The rain was pouring so hard I could barely see. My husband threw my suitcase on the sidewalk and told me to get out. I was 6 months pregnant. His mother stood at the door, smiling. They had no idea that 5 years later, I'd come back to buy everything they owned. Hey everyone, my name is Diane, and what I'm about to tell you is the absolute truth, every word of it. If you've ever been underestimated, thrown away, or told you weren't good enough, this story is for you. Stay until the end because my revenge was sweeter than anything I could have imagined. And please hit that subscribe button right now because you won't want to miss what happens next. Trust me on this. I need to take you back to the beginning, to when I actually thought I had everything figured out. I was 28 years old, married to a man named Brandon, and we'd been together for 3 years. We met in college at one of those boring library study sessions, and honestly, it felt like something out of a movie. He was charming, attentive, and he made me feel like I was the only woman in the world. We got married 6 months after graduation, and I genuinely believed we'd grow old together. I was working as a nurse at the county hospital, pulling long shifts and coming home exhausted, but happy. Brandon worked at his mother's real estate company, and that should have been my first red flag, but love makes you blind to things you should definitely see. Margaret? That was my mother-in-law's name, and from the very first day I met her, she looked at me like I was dirt on her expensive shoes. She never thought I was good enough for her precious son. Not educated enough, not classy enough, not wealthy enough. It didn't matter that I had a degree or that I was saving lives every single day at the hospital. To her, I was just the girl who trapped her son. But Brandon would always defend me, or at least I thought he did. He'd tell me not to worry about her, that she'd come around eventually. Spoiler alert, she never did. Instead, she worked every single day to poison my marriage from the inside out. Things started changing when I got pregnant. I thought having a baby would bring us closer together, you know? I imagined Brandon rubbing my feet after work, talking to my belly, getting excited about becoming a father. Instead, he grew distant, cold. He started working late nights, and when I'd call the office, his mother would answer and tell me he'd already left. But he wouldn't come home for hours. I'd find text messages that he'd quickly explain away. I'd smell perfume that wasn't mine. And like an idiot, I believed every excuse because I wanted to believe them. I was 6 months pregnant and terrified of raising a baby alone, so I convinced myself I was just being hormonal and paranoid. Then one night, I couldn't sleep. Brandon was snoring next to me, and his phone kept lighting up on the nightstand. I know you're not supposed to go through your partner's phone, but something in my gut told me I needed to look. So I did, and what I found shattered my entire world into a million pieces. Messages, hundreds of them, to a woman named Crystal, who worked as his mother's assistant. They'd been seeing each other for 8 months. 8 months! The messages were explicit, romantic, and worst of all, they talked about me. About how I was just a mistake he made in college, about how he was planning to leave me after the baby was born, about how his mother was helping him figure out the legal side of things so I'd get as little as possible in the divorce. I confronted him the next morning. I was shaking, holding that phone in my hand like evidence at a crime scene, and I just asked him to tell me the truth. And you know what he did? He didn't even try to deny it. He looked at me with these cold eyes I'd never seen before and said, "Yeah, it's true. I've been seeing Crystal, and honestly, Diane, my mother was right about you from the start. You were never good enough for this family. I don't know why I thought you were." Those words hit me harder than any physical blow ever could. I stood there in our kitchen, 6 months pregnant with his child, and watched the man I loved transform into a complete stranger. I begged him. I'm not proud of it, but I begged. I told him we could work through it, that we could go to counselling, that I'd forgive him if he just ended it with Crystal and committed to our family. He laughed, actually laughed in my face and said, "There's nothing to work through. I want you gone." That's when Margaret walked in. She had a key to our house, of course, because boundaries didn't exist with that woman. She looked at me with this satisfied smirk and said, "Finally? Brandon, help me pack her things. She needs to leave today." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was my home too. My name was on the lease, but they didn't care. Margaret started pulling my clothes out of the closet while I just stood there in shock. Brandon grabbed a suitcase from the garage and started throwing my belongings into it carelessly, like I was garbage he couldn't wait to take out. I tried calling my parents, but we'd been estranged for years after a falling out about my marriage. I called a few friends, but no one answered. It was like the universe had abandoned me all at once. The whole time they were packing my life into 2 suitcases, I kept thinking this had to be a nightmare, that I'd wake up and everything would be normal again. But it wasn't a nightmare, it was my reality, and it was about to get so much worse. By the time they finished packing, it was evening and the sky had opened up. Rain was absolutely pouring down, the kind of rain that soaks you to the bone in seconds. I looked at Brandon one more time and said, "Please don't do this. I'm pregnant. Where am I supposed to go?" And Margaret, that evil woman, stepped forward and said, "That baby probably isn't even his anyway. Good riddance to both of you." Then Brandon picked up my suitcases, walked to the front door, and literally threw them out onto the wet sidewalk. When I didn't move fast enough, he grabbed my arm and pushed me toward the door. Not hard enough to hurt the baby, but hard enough to make it clear he wanted me gone. I stood on that sidewalk in the pouring rain, watching my husband and his mother close the door on me. I could see them through the window, hugging each other like they'd just accomplished something great. I was soaking wet, pregnant, homeless, and more alone than I'd ever been in my entire life. I tried 2 more friends before finally getting through to Nicole, my old college roommate. She lived 40 minutes away, but she didn't even hesitate. She said, "Stay right where you are. I'm coming to get you." And she did. That night at Nicole's apartment, I couldn't stop shaking. Not from the cold, but from the shock of everything that had happened. The stress triggered contractions, and Nicole rushed me to the emergency room. The doctors managed to stop the contractions and told me the baby was okay, but I needed to reduce my stress levels. Reduce my stress levels. I'd just lost my husband, my home, and my entire life in one night, and they wanted me to relax. But lying in that hospital bed, hooked up to monitors, feeling my baby move inside me, something shifted. I made myself a promise right then and there. I would never, ever let anyone make me feel worthless again. I would build a life so incredible that Brandon and Margaret would choke on their regret. 3 months later, I gave birth to my daughter, Autumn. The moment I held her, everything made sense. She was perfect, with these bright, curious eyes that seemed to see right into my soul. Nicole let us stay with her, and I worked 2 jobs to save money. I worked as a nurse during the day and picked up night shifts at a medical clinic on weekends. I was exhausted constantly, but every time I looked at Autumn, I found the strength to keep going. She was my reason for everything. When Autumn was about 4 months old, I met Harrison Cole. I was at the hospital during one of my shifts, and he was there visiting his aunt who'd had a stroke. We literally bumped into each other in the cafeteria. I was so tired I'd almost fallen asleep standing in line for coffee, and I stumbled right into him, spilling his tea all over his very expensive-looking suit. I was mortified and started apologizing profusely, but he just laughed it off and said, "Don't worry about it. I have about 20 more of these suits at home, but you look like you need this coffee way more than I need dry clothes." There was something about his smile that was just genuinely kind. No ulterior motives, no judgment, just kindness. We started talking, and I found out he'd been raised by a single mother too. His father left when he was 2, and his mum worked 3 jobs to put him through school. He'd built a tech company from nothing and sold it for millions, then started investing in other businesses. Despite all his money, he was remarkably down to earth. Over the next few weeks, he kept showing up at the hospital around the time my shifts ended. He'd bring coffee, ask about autumn, and we'd just talk. I was suspicious at first because men like Harrison didn't usually pay attention to struggling single mothers unless they wanted something. But he never made me feel uncomfortable or indebted to him. He genuinely seemed to just enjoy my company. One day, Harrison offered me a job at his investment firm. He said he needed someone in customer service who actually understood people, and he thought I'd be perfect. The pay was double what I was making as a nurse, and the hours were better. I was terrified because I didn't know anything about finance or investments. But Harrison promised to train me himself, so I took the leap. And it changed everything. I started in customer service, but I was obsessed with learning everything I could about the business. I'd stay late reading reports, studying market trends, asking Harrison a million questions. He was patient with me, encouraging even, and I discovered I had a natural instinct for real estate investment specifically. Harrison became my mentor, and over the next 4 years, I worked my way up in his company while building my own investment portfolio on the side. He taught me everything he knew, never holding back information or treating me like I was less capable because I didn't have a business degree. Meanwhile, Autumn was growing up smart and beautiful, and she absolutely adored Harrison. She started calling him Uncle Harry, and watching them together always made my heart feel full. Harrison never tried to replace her father or overstep boundaries. He just loved her naturally, the way you love people who matter to you. Somewhere along the way, Harrison and I fell in love. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was slow and steady and real. One evening, after we'd put Autumn to bed, we were sitting on Nicole's tiny balcony drinking wine, and he just looked at me and said, "Diane, I need to tell you something. I'm in love with you. I've been in love with you for a long time, and I know you might not be ready, and that's okay. I just needed you to know." I was terrified because the last time I trusted a man with my heart, he destroyed me. But Harrison wasn't Brandon. He'd proven that over and over again. So I took another leap and told him I loved him too. We dated for a year before he proposed, and it was the healthiest, most respectful relationship I'd ever experienced. He never made me feel small or inadequate. He celebrated my wins like they were his own. He loved my daughter like she was his own. When he asked me to marry him, I said yes without hesitation. But before we could even start planning the wedding, something interesting landed on my desk at work. Information about a struggling real estate company that was about to auction off its assets. Brandon's company, Margaret's company. The company that I'd once watched from the sidelines was now drowning in debt because of bad investments and poor management. Their flagship property, the main office building that Margaret was so proud of, was being auctioned off to the highest bidder. Harrison immediately offered to buy it for me as a wedding present, but I refused. I told him I needed to do this myself. I'd earned my own money through years of hard work and smart investments, and this victory needed to be mine alone. He understood. So I registered for the auction under my investment company's name, which Brandon and Margaret would never recognize, and I showed up ready to win. The auction was tense. There were several bidders, but I knew exactly how high I was willing to go. When the hammer finally came down, that property was mine. I owned the building that represented everything Margaret thought I'd never achieve. But I wasn't done yet. The real satisfaction would come from seeing their faces when they realized who their new landlord was. So I scheduled a property inspection for the following week and showed up in person. I walked into that office building wearing a designer suit, my hair and makeup perfect, confidence radiating from every pore. I'd transformed from the broken, pregnant woman they'd thrown out into the rain into someone they wouldn't even recognize. And they didn't, not at first. Brandon was in the main office packing boxes, and Margaret was directing movers with her usual bossy tone. They both looked exhausted and defeated. Nothing like the triumphant villains from that horrible night 5 years ago. I introduced myself as the new property owner, and for a solid 30 seconds, they just stared at me blankly. Then recognition dawned on Margaret's face. Her skin went completely white, and she actually grabbed the desk to steady herself. Brandon's mouth literally fell open, and he dropped the box he was holding. The crash of files hitting the floor was the only sound in that office for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Margaret found her voice and whispered, "Diane?" I smiled, calm and collected, and said, "Hello, Margaret." "Hello, Brandon. I'm here to inspect my new property. You have 30 days to vacate the premises." Margaret tried to pull herself together. She started with her usual condescending tone, saying something about how I should show respect for family, how Brandon had made a mistake, but they were still Autumn's father and grandmother. But her voice was shaking, and we all knew she had no power anymore. Brandon just kept staring at me like he was seeing a ghost. He finally stammered, You look so different. I heard you had the baby. How is the baby?" I looked him dead in the eyes and said, "Her name is Autumn. She's 5 years old and she's brilliant, kind, strong, and compassionate. She's everything you'll never be, and she's had a wonderful life without you in it." Just then, Harrison walked in. We'd planned to meet for lunch after my inspection, and his timing was absolutely perfect. He walked right up to me, kissed my cheek, and said, "Sorry I'm late, darling." Traffic was terrible. The diamond engagement ring on my finger caught the light, and I watched Brandon's eyes go straight to it. I introduced them casually. "Brandon, Margaret, this is my fiancé, Harrison Cole." I watched Brandon's face go through about 15 different emotions as he recognized the name. Harrison Cole was famous in business circles, regularly featured in financial magazines and news programs. Margaret actually swayed on her feet, and I thought she might faint. She didn't, but she had to sit down. Brandon tried to speak, tried to say something, but what could he possibly say? That he was sorry for throwing me out while I was pregnant? That he'd made a mistake? Words seemed completely inadequate, and we all knew it. I looked at both of them one final time and said, "That night in the rain, you told me I'd never be anything. You said I wasn't good enough for your family. You threw me away like garbage when I needed you most. Look at me now, really look at me. I built this life from nothing. I raised an incredible daughter on my own. I learned an entirely new career and became successful beyond anything I imagined. And I did it all without you. So thank you, actually. Thank you for showing me exactly how strong I really am." We left them standing there in that office surrounded by boxes and broken dreams. And you know what? The revenge wasn't as sweet as I thought it would be. Don't get me wrong, seeing their faces was satisfying. But the real victory had nothing to do with them. The real victory was the life I'd built. It was Autumn's laugh when Harrison tickled her. It was the career I'd created through my own intelligence and hard work. It was the love I'd found with a man who treated me like an equal partner. It was becoming the woman I was always meant to be. I didn't destroy them, by the way. I could have. I could have made their lives absolutely miserable. But I chose differently. I offered Brandon a basic maintenance position at one of my properties. He refused out of pride, which was his choice to make. Margaret moved into a small apartment and finally learned some humility. Crystal left Brandon about a year after they got married because, turns out, a relationship built on betrayal isn't exactly stable. Who would have thought? Harrison and I got married 6 months later in a beautiful ceremony, surrounded by people who actually loved us. Autumn was our flower girl, and she took her job very seriously, making sure every single petal was perfectly placed. Nicole was my maid of honor, standing beside me like she'd been doing since that rainy night when I had nowhere else to go. As I stood at that altar, holding Harrison's hands and promising to love him forever, I realized something important. That night in the rain, standing on the sidewalk with my suitcases and my broken heart, I thought my life was ending. I thought I'd lost everything, but I was wrong. That night wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. It was the night I stopped letting other people define my worth. It was the night I started fighting for myself and my daughter. It was the night everything actually began. If you're watching this and you're in your own version of that rainy night right now, please hear me. You are not what they say you are. You are not defined by who leaves you or who doesn't see your value. You are defined by how you rise after you fall. You are defined by your courage to keep going when everything seems impossible. I'm not going to lie and say it'll be easy. It won't be. There will be nights when you cry yourself to sleep and days when getting out of bed feels like climbing a mountain. But you have to keep going. You have to believe that you're worth fighting for, because you are. Today, my investment company is worth millions. Autumn is 8 years old and thriving in school, already showing signs of being smarter than both Harrison and me combined. Brandon eventually apologized years later, a genuine apology where he took full accountability for his actions. I forgave him, not for his sake, but for mine, because holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Margaret lives a quiet life now, humbled by how everything turned out. And me? I wake up every morning next to a man who loves me unconditionally. I have a daughter who makes every struggle worth it, and I've built a career that fulfills me in ways I never imagined. The best revenge isn't destroying the people who hurt you. The best revenge is becoming everything they said you couldn't be. It's building a life so beautiful that their opinions become irrelevant. It's finding peace and joy and success on your own terms. That's real power. That's real victory. If this story touched you in any way, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their current chapter is not their final chapter. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever had a moment that broke you but ultimately made you stronger? I read every single comment, and I'd love to hear your story. Remember, you're stronger than you think, more capable than you know, and more worthy than anyone ever made you feel. The rain doesn't last forever. The sun always comes back out, and when it does, you'll be standing there, stronger than ever, ready to build the life you deserve. I'll see you in the next video.